Hello, 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 and welcome to OPG Live. I am your host, Ian Plant, and I'm here today with my co-host, Lilia Khalif with Outdoor Photography Guide. Thank you very much for attending this event. I'm looking forward to getting your questions as we proceed in the event. I just wanted to start off by saying I was hoping to have my fellow photographer, Zach Mills, on today to interview, but right now Zach is having a baby, or at least his wife is having a baby. At least I hope that's what's going on, because if Zach is having the baby, him and his wife got it all wrong. But she is very pregnant. They'll be having their baby anytime now, so I didn't want to schedule him for this event for an interview because I was afraid that she would go into labor. So hopefully next OPG Live, I'm going to be able to bring in a guest like Zach or someone else, one of the many professional photographers that I know and work with, so we can liven things up and get some alternate perspectives. In today's episode, I'm going to be sharing some images from my trip in Kenya, to Kenya in July. I went there with Zach, and we photographed the big cats of Kenya, lions, cheetahs, and leopards. And we also filmed an instructional video that's going to be available very soon to OPG Premium and Gold members. And it'll also be on the OPG shop for anyone who wants to buy and download that course individually. And we have a preview video today from that course that we're going to play for you in just a little bit. And then I'm going to talk about some of the photos that I made when I was in Kenya. I'm going to discuss my favorite techniques for wildlife photography. And then I am going to answer your questions about wildlife photography specifically. But if you've got some questions that are a little bit broader about photography generally, we'll entertain some of those as well. So why don't we start off just with a preview video of my new Kenya course, just to give you an idea the kinds of things that Zach and I saw when we were there, the kinds of things that we discussed in the course, and the kinds of photos that we made. Lilia, roll that Kenya footage.
All right.
Hi, I'm Zach Mills.
And I'm Ian Plant, and we're on safari in Kenya right now, photographing wildlife. In particular, we're looking for the big cats, lions, leopards, and cheetahs.
We are in one of the world's finest wildlife reserves, with iconic rivers, breathtaking vistas of rolling grass plains filled with a large abundance and variety of animals. We also timed our visit to coincide with the Great Migration, where more than 1 million wildebeest will plunge across the Mara River in their quest for food.
And while we're here, we're going to share the techniques that we use to make compelling wildlife photos.
This ecosystem produces dramatic and dynamic weather patterns with highly photogenic lighting effects, such as storm clouds, golden sunrises and sunsets, and beautiful colors at twilight. We're hoping that our photos tell a story of these big cats on the Great Plains, their constant search for food, the threats to their existence and survival, and the endless interaction between predator and prey.
So join us on this incredible photo adventure.
All right. That was super cool, Ian. Do you want to fill us on maybe what your favorite animals were to photograph while you were there? Lots to choose from, I know.
Well, there is lots to choose from. When you go to a place like Kenya or Tanzania, the Serengeti Plains, the Maasai Mara, there is an incredible abundance of wildlife. You just see literally millions of animals everywhere around you. Of course, if you're there during the wildebeest or the zebra migration, that number I just gave, millions, is indeed quite literal. Millions of these animals come through and cross the Mara River. They do so on a regular basis. So when I was there in July, that was the beginning of the migration that lasts through August and into September. And they also migrate earlier in the year as well. And if you're lucky, you can see hundreds and thousands of wildebeest crossing the Mara River at once. And it's a real amazing spectacle. They line up for miles and miles in this long line of wildebeest. And when you get a big group going through, the line just seems to go on forever and ever. You can sit there for hours and watch them pass with no let up in sight. And the crossing of the Mara River is a really exciting event because it's dangerous. There are predators in the river. There are crocodiles that are waiting for the wildebeest to go by. And if you're lucky, you can see crocodiles attacking the wildebeest, though a lot of people have been spoiled by photos that they've seen of the event. It makes, I think, photographers think that all you have to do is sit there and wait and you'll see the crocodiles attack the wildebeest. The truth of the matter is the crocodiles aren't nearly as prolific as the photos that have come out from that area would suggest. And so actually seeing a crocodile attack a wildebeest is pretty rare. More often than not, the wildebeest die because they're trampled during the crossing by other wildebeest. One morning when Zach and I were there, we saw about 30 or 50 wildebeest that had died during a crossing. The wildebeest had picked a bad place to cross, and there was a very steep bank, and so there was some panic, and the animals started running in the wrong direction, and a bunch of them got trampled, and they were left there. And that's usually when the predators come in, like the crocodiles, looking for an easy meal. So that's a much more common thing to see than actually seeing that predator-prey interaction. And all the wildebeest and the zebra and the other animals that come to these plains, they attract a lot of predators. And the best predators that you'll see there are the big cats, the lions, the leopards, and the cheetahs. And of course, they are amazing animals. I love photographing the wildebeest and the other grazing animals that come to the plains. It's always great to see elephants. Elephants are probably my favorite animal on the planet. But when it comes to the photography, there's nothing quite like photographing the big cats like the lions, the leopards, and the cheetahs. So it can be really, really amazing watching as these animals move around the plains and hunt and search for food and interact with one another. It's an incredible place to do some photography. So now I'm going to share some of the photos that I took when I was in Kenya. And I'm going to discuss some of the techniques that Zach and I use to make these kinds of photos. And these are the techniques that we discuss in the course. So we're going to move over to my photos now.
All right. I just also want to remind everybody quick, while we're looking through the photos, think of some questions about wildlife photography that you may want to ask and start putting them in the chat. We'll try and answer as many as we can, but by all means, start thinking of your live questions right away.
Samara is that it attracts a lot of grazing animals, a lot of prey animals that attract a fair amount of predators. So the wildebeest migration is the most significant event of the Serengeti and Masai Mara plains. And it's one of the biggest wildlife migrations on the planet. So every year you can go there and see millions of these animals as they cross from Tanzania over to Kenya and vice versa. And all of these prey animals attract a lot of predators. And there's a lot of really big family groups of cheetahs in the Masai Mara. This particular photo shows a mother and her two cubs. The cubs are almost fully grown. So they look like adult cheetahs. We actually saw a group of 5 male cheetahs that had banded together as a coalition that were hunting together. And this is something that isn't seen that often, very unprecedented to see that many cheetahs come together. I've seen 3 cheetahs come together quite frequently, but that's usually the maximum. So seeing a group of 5 was a real treat. And we spent a lot of time tracking these animals, following them, staying with them as they traveled throughout the plains looking for food. And another thing that's really great about this area is the weather. What I really love about the Masai Mara of Kenya is the storms that come through this area. Lots of beautiful storm clouds build up almost on a daily basis. There's a lot of rain, and this can make the photography tricky. If you're there during the rainy season, getting around is very difficult. You don't want too much rain and too much clouds. But when these stormy clouds build up, I start thinking about doing wide-angle photography. And because Kenya has such an abundance of wildlife, and if you have the appropriate permit, you can go off-road, you can end up getting very close to the wildlife. There's a lot of big wildlife, but even with the cats and some of the other smaller animals, the ones that aren't as big as the elephants, for example, you can still get really close. And I start thinking about wide-angle photography when these beautiful giant storm clouds build up. So as I mentioned before, the cheetahs are a lot of fun to photograph, one of my favorite animals to photograph. But shots like this clean portrait taken with a telephoto lens, that's not really the kind of photography that I like to do. I prefer to do something a bit more visually interesting, something that's more complex in terms of the composition. So I think a lot of wildlife photographers, they view this sort of clean portrait as being the holy grail of wildlife photography. I'm looking for something a bit more interesting. So I like to include more of the animal's surroundings. So if I'm a little farther away, I can still work with a telephoto lens. By getting low for this particular shot of a cheetah up on a termite mound, I was able to include a lot of the foreground grasses as a visual element within the composition. And by shooting wide open using a large aperture like f2.8 or f4 with telephoto lens, anything that's not directly focused on will be rendered as an out of focus blur. So I like to incorporate these out of focus blurs as a visual element to give a certain degree of artistic abstraction to my photos. More than that, I also like to get really creative with light. And so I'm looking for opportunities to work with animals that are selectively lit. So for example, this is a photograph of a leopard, and it was early in the morning and the sun was rising through some trees, and the sun was shining through the gaps in the trees. And in this particular instance, spotlit the leopard. Everything else around the leopard was still in shadow. So having that spotlight effect helps the leopard stand out from its surroundings more, and the contrast in the light helped me create a more expressive image. So I'm always looking for ways to push the boundaries with light and to get very creative with light. I love working in backlighting. That's something that I discuss a lot in the course. And it's, for example, we've got a 5-minute segment of the course where we are shooting with a bunch of lion cubs backlit by the rising sun on a clear morning. And backlighting is really beautiful. It can be tricky to work with backlighting because often you're getting flare on your lens, and that flare can be a good thing because you're shooting wide open. The flare spreads out across the entire image frame, and it gives the image this low contrast, warm, gauzy look. But sometimes that can make getting focus tricky, and that's one of the most challenging things when you're working with backlit animals. So I try to find an area of the animal where my autofocus can lock on, and quite often I'm looking for an area with a lot of contrast, like the rimlet ear of the lion cub in this particular photo was easier for the autofocus to lock onto that. Autofocus looks for areas of high contrast. So you want to try to find those high contrast areas and lock your focus onto those areas if you're having problems with focus while shooting backlit. And the colors are really amazing when you're shooting backlit. I like to go wide and use wide angle lenses, especially if there's a lot of color and drama with clouds in the sky. So I mentioned earlier the stormy clouds that you can find in this area. And it really makes shooting at sunrise and sunset very dramatic. And so when I've got those really amazing clouds, I like to go wide. So for this particular shot of a giraffe, the giraffe are fairly skittish, and they usually won't let you get very close. So this was as close as I could get with my 24mm lens. And even then, the giraffe was beginning to edge away, so I could only get the shot really quick before it took off, and I decided not to bother it anymore. But what I did is I positioned myself so that the sun was rising just behind the giraffe. And because I went wide, I was able to include that curving sweep of those colorful sunrise clouds, and just to have that hint of lens flare coming through around the giraffe creates a really nice silhouette effect. So this is where I really feel that wildlife photography can get very expressive and creative, and you can create some really unique images when you start working with a wider angle of view. And here's another shot of a cheetah climbing a tree in the morning. It was actually that one mother and her 2 cubs that I showed you earlier on the termite mound. They were here at this tree, and the 2 cubs were up on the tree playing. A lot of times cheetahs will climb up on objects like termite mounds or trees to get a better view when they're hunting. But the young cheetahs like to play on these sorts of objects as well. So this particular cheetah kept running up and down the tree with this beautiful sunrise in the background. So we got close with the vehicle and took out our wide angle lenses. So I was able to include the cheetah and the tree in silhouette, and lots of that glorious sunrise sky in the background. I wish I had been able to go a little wider even. I think when I've got big clouds like that, I love to really play creatively with the colors and the shapes of the clouds in the sky. And here's another example of using dramatic lighting. And this is an effect that's called rim lighting. So when you have a really bright light behind a translucent subject, or a subject that's got translucent on its edges, like fur or feathers or hair, you get this rimlet effect. So I dramatically underexposed this image. My exposure compensation was set to maybe -2 or -3 for this image. So everything goes dark. The only thing I'm doing is exposing for those bright highlights. And so all you can see is the bright highlights, the fringe of the fur around this female lion. And this effect works best when you have really strong bright light. So this particular morning was a very clear sunrise. There were no clouds, there was no haze, no smoke in the distance. So the sunlight was very strong and very colorful, creating a lot of contrast, allowing me to achieve this very dramatic rimlet effect. I also especially enjoy incorporating twilight and night skies into my photography, and I took this at the camp I was staying at when I was in the Masai Mara, and this is one of the local Maasai men who was working at the camp, who was very eager to pose for me for a photograph at night. As a matter of fact, I discovered that the local Maasai, they love getting their pictures taken, so they will put on their traditional clothing and they'll bring their spears with them, and they just love getting their photos taken this way. So for this particular shot, I did a 30-second exposure with a wide angle lens. I set my aperture to f2.8, so I was letting in lots and lots of light, and I used a high ISO 3200, so I could record the stars and the Milky Way in the sky. And during the exposure, I fired my flash. I used a device called a snoot, which you put on your flash. And I know it's a funny name, snoot. It's okay if you're giggling right now. They need to come up with a better name for it. But a snoot, basically, it's designed to create selective illumination, so it narrows the beam of the light coming out of your flash. So I use the snoot and the flash to selectively light the Maasai man under the night sky for this particular shot. So I love incorporating artificial light into my photography. And when I get a chance to do it with the wildlife photography, you can use a flash or a spotlight. When you're working at the sunrise and sunset times, what I typically do is I underexpose the sky to bring out the color and the drama of the clouds. That also puts the foreground into deep shadow, and then I use artificial light to selectively light my wildlife subjects, doing this with a wide angle lens. And you can get some very creative effects. And this is something I enjoy doing with my wildlife photography as much as possible. Cheetahs are great subjects. Lions, male lions in particular, are a lot of fun to photograph during these twilight times. And in these photos, because I'm underexposing the photo, it's actually not as dark as it looks in the photo. To the eye, it's still quite bright out. It's really at that sunrise, sunset time. But by underexposing the photo, you can make it look like it's much darker and much later. And that's the great thing about photography, is that through the photographic process, you can alter the reality of the scene or subject by adjusting your exposure, by adjusting your focus, by adding supplemental light. These are all things that the photographer can do to change the way the scene looks, to alter that reality through the photographic process. So it's something that I'm always trying to do. I'm always trying to think creatively about the use of supplemental light. So for example, with this cheetah who had popped up on a termite mound right in front of me, with the sun rising behind her, I took out my telephoto lens and got a nice tight portrait. And I was using supplemental flash at low power to just add a little bit of fill light to the cheetah. I didn't want to do too much because it looks artificial, just enough to bring out some of the detail in the cheetah. And then I waited for a moment when she gave me a mighty roar. Actually, she was yawning. I think she was a little bored. But to all of you, it's a mighty roar. So, I'm always looking for ways to bring color, composition, and the magic of the moment together to make expressive photos. And I've said earlier, I really love working with clouds. Clouds bring color to the sky, and they also allow you to use shapes creatively. So for this particular shot, the shape of the cloud in the sky was really interesting and expressive. It looks like the bat signal to me. Lilia, doesn't it look like the bat signal?
It does indeed.
We were just talking about Batman earlier. And so I was real excited when I took this photo because of this expressive shape. Of course, everyone sees it differently. Zach, who was with me, he's from Canada, so he saw a maple leaf. So everyone, the great thing about expressive shapes in your photographs is everyone's going to interpret them differently, but it is going to get everyone intrigued and interested in your photo. It's going to arouse curiosity, and these are all good things when you're trying to create an emotional connection with your viewers and to link the photo you've taken and your viewer visually and emotionally. And so by working with this really interesting colorful sky, using the shape of the cloud in the sky, and then bringing it all together, the icing on the cake, just a little hint of flash artificial light on my subject in the foreground, I was able to create a very unique and expressive and personal wildlife photograph that's a lot different from the way most people shoot their wildlife photographs. So I think this is a good time for me to pause and answer some questions. Let's see what we've got.
Technical error. All right, our first question is from Barbara, and she asks for some top tips and tricks for taking photos of flying and or moving animals.
Okay, so when you've got fast moving animals, the first thing you probably want to have is a fast shutter speed if you're looking to slow down or freeze the action. So depending on how fast the animal is moving and what direction it's moving, you may need a much higher speed than other circumstances. So my go-to shutter speed for moving animals is usually 1/500th of a second or higher. But if the animals are moving very fast, 1/1000th of a second or higher is typically preferable. Like if a bird is flying, usually they're going very, very fast. So you need that fast shutter speed to capture the action. If the animal's coming straight towards you, you can probably get away with a slower speed than if it's crossing at an angle, if it's moving perpendicular to you, because then the relative motions is much more. So you need that faster shutter speed. So it really all depends on how fast the animal's moving and what sort of effect you want. If you don't want to completely freeze the action, if you want to introduce some dynamic motion blur, then you can experiment with a slower shutter speed. And the trick there is to try to find the right shutter speed so that you have part of the animal sharply in focus, like the head and the eyes, but maybe the wings if it's a bird flying, or the legs moving, or the background if you're panning with the animal. So usually about 1/90th of a second, 1/80th of a second is a good idea to start when you're working with that mix of motion blur and frozen action. Flash is also a very useful accessory when you want to freeze the action of a moving animal, especially if you want to mix in a little bit of motion blur, because a flash fires with a very short burst. So if you're using flash to illuminate the animal that's moving fast, it'll freeze the action of the animal. And then if you have the exposure still running, so let's say you are working with a subject that's running past you, let's say it's a cheetah, and it's running right past you, and you're panning with your subject, and you decide you want to incorporate some motion blur, so you set your shutter speed to 1/30th of a second as you're panning with the animal. When you fire the flash, the cheetah will be frozen in time, but then the exposure will continue to move, and that background will blur nicely around the cheetah, so you can mix the frozen action and the motion blur. So shutter speed is, of course, a primary consideration, depending on the ultimate look that you want for your photo. Another thing you need to consider is the autofocus. And when an animal is moving towards you or away from you, I think you'll find that the autofocus is going to work better than if it's moving very quickly across the image frame, because then it might be more difficult for you to move with and track that subject. So autofocus is always a consideration. I shoot in predictive autofocus mode with my Canon camera that's called AI Servo. And this basically tracks the movement of a subject. And I use back button focus instead of the front shutter focus for the animal. When you're using the front shutter focus as the animal moves, if you want to recompose, then you're no longer focusing on the animal. As soon as you press the shutter, the camera will try to focus on whatever is in front of it. And you may lose the subject in focus. With back button focus, it'll track the animal as it moves as long as you're pressing that back button. But as soon as you take your finger off the back button, you can press the shutter button without the camera trying to refocus. So this is great if the composition you want doesn't actually put the animal on one of your autofocus points. So you can move with your subject, and then you can take your finger off the button, very quickly recompose, and your subject will still be sharp. So back button focus, using your camera's predictive autofocus, tracking autofocus mode, and making sure you've got a fast shutter speed are all things that will help you get sharp images of your wildlife subjects. And then it just takes practice. If you're working with subjects that are moving across the image frame, learning how to pan with those subjects, to move the camera and to track them as the animal's moving, that just takes practice. That just takes getting out there, doing it as much as possible until you learn how to do it in a fluid and accurate manner.
All right, our next question is from SISTAR, who asks, what is your most used metering mode, or is that pretty subjective based on the photo?
Yeah, that's exactly it. It's very subjective based on the photo. I actually typically just use the camera's normal evaluative metering mode. I might switch over to spot metering if I'm in a particularly tricky lighting situation like backlighting. But more often than not, what I do is whatever mode I'm in, I just take a quick test shot, and then I look at my histogram on the resulting photo, and then I make adjustments using exposure compensation. Now, I'm typically shooting, when I'm shooting wildlife, I'm typically shooting in shutter priority mode. So I'm picking the shutter speed that I want to freeze the action. And usually more often than not, especially since I like working in lower light situations, that means the camera is selecting automatically an aperture that is wide open, which is great for blurring out that background. You can also shoot in manual mode where you're manually setting the aperture and your shutter speed, so you can control both variables, and then you let your ISO float using auto ISO, and that way the camera automatically adjusts to changes in the light. Some cameras, that works great. Other cameras don't really let you use exposure compensation, so whatever metering that your camera gives you, you're stuck with, even if it's wrong, if it's too bright or too dark. So I typically avoid using manual mode when I'm shooting wildlife. And I don't often use aperture mode. Usually I use that when I'm shooting landscape, because with landscape, your depth of field is a very important variable. So with wildlife, aperture is important, but you typically want to shoot wide open. And as I said before, when I'm shooting in shutter priority in lower light, the camera's almost always choosing that wide open aperture. So those are the modes I use. I prefer using auto ISO, because that way, if the light changes, you don't have to constantly be readjusting your ISO. And so the ISO just floats with the changing light. So it's just one less thing you have to worry about. But when you're shooting in these auto modes or these priority modes, you always have to use exposure compensation to make sure that you get the exposure just right. So it's a good idea to check the photos that you're taking, not just shooting blind. Every now and then I'll stop and pull up one of the images I've taken and look at the histogram to make sure I'm not accidentally overexposing or underexposing the image. And then I use exposure compensation to adjust to make sure that I get the exposure I want and that my camera's not choosing the wrong exposure.
All right, and thinking back to some of the photos in your recent trip, especially at night where some of the big cats may have the bat signal on them or some bright lights, James is wondering, how does the flash affect the animals that are being photographed?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So most animals don't even notice flash. To me, the time you have to be the most concerned about using artificial light with animals is at night, especially nocturnal animals that have eyes that are adjusted to the darkness. So you want to avoid flashing animals at night, just because they, usually it doesn't bother them too much, but you may notice they'll blink a little bit as their eyes adjust. I go through this every morning when I wake up to feed my cats, and I go downstairs and I turn the light on. My cat's eyes they blink for a few seconds. They don't like it, but it doesn't really do any permanent damage. And it's the same thing with a lot of animals at night with flash. So the photos that you've seen, as I said, it's not really as dark as it looks in the photo because I'm underexposing the photos. And so it's actually a lot brighter out. And I'm always using flash at low power. I don't like the look of the high power flash, so I'm using flash compensation, typically -2 or -3. That reduces the flash output. And for the most part, the animals don't even notice if you're using the flash. I've very rarely had an animal even acknowledge the presence of the flash. So if you're using the flash the right way and you're avoiding shooting nocturnal animals at night using flash, you shouldn't have any problems with disturbing the animal. And it's a good rule of thumb, if you are disturbing the animal, if they are showing visible signs of distress because you've used the flash, just stop using the flash. It's pretty simple. It's not, chances are there's very few species where you might actually do something that causes any real harm. You know, the main concern is if you're trying to photograph bats or owls that hunt at night and they're specialized to hunt at night. If you fire a flash when an owl is flying, it might become, you know, temporarily disoriented. It might mess up its hunt. So these aren't good things. These are things you want to avoid doing. And, you know, as always, my wildlife subjects, I try to make sure that they are comfortable and that they are not distressed by my presence, because they are. I'm not going to get the photos that I want. So I believe that whenever you're doing any work with wildlife, you should approach the animal incrementally, whether it's getting closer to the animal or using artificial light. Start off small, incrementally approach. That way, if the animal doesn't like what you're doing, they have a chance to very calmly signal their distress, and you can back off and give the animal some more space.
Okay, and to elaborate that on in flash in general, Glenn asks, how close do you need to be to use flash effectively, especially, you know, for maybe some more hardcore wildlife you're shooting as opposed to like a house cat?
So, you know, most flash units today have a pretty good range, and you know, there are some cheaper units that won't go as far. The more expensive units can probably throw flash as much as 200 or 300 feet, and you can use adapters on your flash, like a flash extender, which will give you more range. So you don't really necessarily need to be close. The brighter it is out, the brighter the ambient light, the less effective your flash is going to be. So when it's darker out, your flash is going to appear to go farther than it would during the middle of the day. So it also depends on when you're shooting, but you don't need to be super close to most wildlife subjects to use flash. And because I advocate using the flash at low power to add some supplemental light, you typically don't even need to be that close because of that. When you're using it at low power, it's giving you just want a hint of light. You don't need as much light as you would need if you were at full power. So if you're a little farther away, that actually helps soften the light a little bit. So you don't need to be super close. But, you know, typically when I'm working with flash, if the animal's farther than 30 or 40 feet away, I'm not really using the flash nearly as much as if it's a bit closer than that. So the farther away you are, the more complications arise from the distance. But you still should be able to use flash effectively from the kinds of working distances that are typical when you're shooting wildlife. Now, in areas like in Kenya and Tanzania, you can often get very, very close to very big wildlife, so it makes using flash a lot easier. In some places, the flash might be more skittish, but I've used flash to make photos of animals that were 40 or 50 feet away. No problem.
No problem. All right, our next question comes from Bruce, who asks, for wildlife photography, do you generally shoot in manual mode, aperture priority, or shutter priority?
Well, I just talked about this. Shutter priority is usually my go-to for wildlife, because more often than not, the shutter speed is the most important variable that you have, because you want to either freeze the action or get creative maybe with a little bit of motion blur. So I find that shutter priority used in conjunction with auto ISO works best for me. I do know a lot of wildlife photographers who shoot in aperture priority because they want to make sure they always have that wide open aperture to creatively blur their foreground and background in a photo. So a lot of guys will shoot so that they're always at their maximum aperture, whether it's f2.8 or f4. As I said before, that, you know, for me, most of the wildlife shooting I'm doing is in low light. I don't really like working in the middle of the day, so sunrise, sunset, and twilight is my favorite time for wildlife photography. And then my camera in shutter priority mode is almost always defaulting to the maximum aperture, so I don't have to worry about it. If it is something I'm worried about, if I need a little extra depth of field when I'm taking a photo, I will usually switch over to manual mode, so I can set both my aperture and my shutter speed manually, and then with auto ISO, the camera will automatically select an ISO that changes with the changing of the light.
All right, our next question comes from Marcia, and she asks, what is your workflow like in terms of post-processing?
Well, Marcia, that is a very general question. I could probably spend many, many hours. The whole time here, we could go on for several weeks. One place you can go to get more information about my processing workflow is members of people who have gold membership with Outdoor Photography Guide, get access to a number of benefits. One of the benefits are regular classes that I give, which often talk about post-processing. So that is a really great way to learn more about my post-processing workflow, is to sign up for the Gold membership. There's a lot of great benefits for Gold members. And certainly I can say that as a general matter, I try to do processing with a light touch. I'm an advocate of getting it right. I think of myself more as a traditional photographer. And so I believe getting it right in the field. I work very hard to get really amazing moments and lighting conditions when I'm in the field. And my processing workflow tends to have a rather light touch compared to what a lot of people are doing these days. But if you're interested in learning more about my processing workflow, I strongly suggest you consider Gold membership.
All right, I'm going to combine two questions, the next one here, one from Greg and one from Charlie. Greg asks, what are your favorite lenses for wildlife shooting? And Charlie asks, what lenses are in your gear pack for when you're going out wildlife shooting?
All right, so my favorite lenses are, I'm a Canon shooter, so I'm going to list my favorite. Most of them are Canon lenses, but some of them are third-party lenses. There are, of course, many great lenses from other camera systems out there as well. These are just, the systems I use. So my top-down favorite lens for wildlife shooting is my Canon 200 to 400 zoom lens with a built-in 1.4 extender. So that gives me an effective range of 200 millimeters to 560 millimeters. And what I really love about this lens is that the built-in extender, I can flip a switch to engage the extender or to turn it off. So the challenge of working with teleconverters or extender is that you have to put them in between your camera and your lens. So if you've got the extender on, for example, and the animal comes too close, you've got to take 10 seconds to take the camera off the lens, take the extender off, and then put the camera and the lens back together. And that can really cut seriously into your shooting time. So I like having that built-in extender with that lens. I love working with zoom lenses over fixed lenses because I like the compositional flexibility and creativity that they allow me. So that's why I prefer to work with that. Of course, fixed focal length lenses are great because they have these really wide open maximum apertures, and they tend to be very sharp. So you can get a lot of great visual effects that you can't quite get with even a high quality zoom lens. So my 200 to 400 has a maximum aperture of f4. And when I engage the extender, that maximum aperture becomes f5.6. So if you're working with a fixed focal length lens, like a 300 2.8 lens, that's a faster lens. It lets in more light. It allows you to have less depth of field when you're using 2.8 instead of f4. So that blurs the background out a little bit better. So those fixed focal length lenses, they can be really great if you're looking to get specific types of wildlife shots, but they don't give you as much flexibility as a zoom. Right. So, sorry, that's okay.
No, keep going.
Once I move away from the 200 to 400, depending on what I'm shooting, I think my favorite lenses then are my wide angle lenses. I love working with fast wide angle lenses, especially during the twilight, to get that mix of twilight colors and artificial light. And so I'm often using my Canon 11 to 24 millimeter lens, my Sigma 24 1.4 f1.4 art lens is a really great lens for working in the twilight. And these are the lenses I really love using more than anything. So there's kind of this gap in between the super telephoto and the super wide angle lenses. But to fill that gap, I like working with a 70 to 200 lens. That's a great zoom for wildlife work. So when you're working with bigger animals or where the animal comes in a little bit closer than your super telephoto lenses, having a really fast f2.8 70 to 200, Canon, Nikon, Tamron, Sigma all have really great lenses that are in this range. I think it's an indispensable lens when you're photographing wildlife.
All right, I want to just address something that just came up in the chat from Susan, and this webinar will be replayed on the OPG website. You can go back and rewatch it anytime, so don't worry if you're not going to make it all right now, if you're watching it at your desk at work, or if you just don't have time to sit through the whole webinar, it will be available for rewatch on the Outdoor Photography Guide website. So our next question is from Rob, playing off again, talking about your gear and the lenses you like. How do you pack for an airplane, and what do you keep with you and or banish to cargo?
So airplane travel has gotten a lot trickier in the past 10 years, and a lot of airlines are increasingly restricting the amount and the weight of stuff that you can bring with you on the plane. So the equipment that gets banished to my checked luggage tends to be the really big, heavy stuff, like my tripod, and maybe some of the miscellaneous accessories if I find my camera bag is a little too packed with stuff. So maybe my flash might go in there. I try to avoid putting any of my expensive electronics in my checked bag, because a lot of airlines and a lot of airports around the world will warn you against doing that. And I certainly don't want to have any of my lenses, if I can avoid it, or my cameras in my checked bag. So the non-essential, non-expensive accessories go into the check bag, and the check bag is always locked with a TSA approved lock that helps reduce the chance of theft. Now, with airlines, you can sometimes run into problems when you're bringing a heavy camera bag. So I will almost always have all of my cameras and lenses, and usually my flash, in my carry-on bag. And I found that there's a few ways of kind of skirting around the weight issues. For one, if you carry your equipment in a backpack on your back, they're much less likely to weigh your bag or ask you to check it than if you have like a roll-on bag. Those are usually get heightened scrutiny from airline personnel. So if it's on my back and I do my best to be casual and pretend that it doesn't weigh 20 or 30 pounds, I almost never get asked to have my bag weighed or to check my bag. And if they do weigh my bag or ask me to check it, I explain to them that it's a lot of really expensive camera equipment. And almost always at that point, the airline personnel will let you take the bag on, because they don't want to have to deal with the issues of really expensive equipment being damaged. So if you explain the situation, more often than not, you can get away with it. If you do have a problem, I did once have a problem when I was flying to the Galapagos, where they have very strict weight limits. They weigh all the bags when you're making the flight to the islands. I found that if you disperse the equipment among your carry-on items, you can usually get away with it. So I had to take a big lens out of my camera bag, but I was able to stuff it in the second computer bag that I was carrying. And I was able to put a few lenses in my pockets. So if you break up the equipment creatively, so I always have my camera bag, and then I always have a separate laptop bag just in case I need to shift some equipment around. More often than not, you can find a way to get on the plane without running afoul of the weight restrictions. So I've personally only the once, when I went to the Galapagos, had a problem with the equipment. On the other hand, I also pack as light as I can. I make sure that I'm not bringing a ton of lenses. So I'm not bringing a 600 millimeter lens and a 500 millimeter lens and a 300 millimeter lens and then a bunch of other smaller lenses. I've got the one big zoom lens, and then the 200 to 400, and then maybe a 70 to 200, and then maybe a 24 to 70 and my 11 to 24. So 4 lenses, 2 cameras, and a flash. Usually that keeps within the spirit of most airline weight limits. So I typically don't have a problem, but you got to plan ahead and plan for the worst possibility. So a lot of guys I know will sometimes carry a photo vest on with them. So if they have to grab a few lenses out of their camera bag, they can stuff them in their photo vest and carry it on the plane, no problem.
Do you have any horror stories of things breaking in transit?
No, I've been rather lucky. I've certainly had some luggage delayed, but usually it hasn't been any. I've had like the occasional tripod that was in a bag that I had checked that showed up 3 days late, so I wasn't able to do any photography. But usually worse than that is the fact that I don't have any clean underwear to wear for a while, and that's very embarrassing when that happens.
Better than your stuff being damaged, though, right?
Right.
All right, we have 2 questions from Fran. 1, do you use the better beamer on your flash? And 2, can you use auto ISO when using flash, or does it result in overexposed photos?
Great questions, Fran. So the better beamer is, for those of you who are not familiar with it, it's a flash extender. These are devices that have a Fresnel lens on the front that narrows and extends the beam of the flash. So this gives you more reach. So the better beamer is one of the brands that are out there. There's plenty of these that are available. I actually, I've got one of these flash extenders, and I use it on occasion, but I don't really tend to use it that much because I'm usually trying to get closer to my wildlife subjects and work with wide angle lenses. So the nature of my photography means that I typically don't need the flash extenders, but they're a really good thing to use, I think. The second part of the question, auto ISO with flash. You do have to be a little careful with auto ISO and flash. I've noticed sometimes that that I get some really weird results, so I have to pay attention to what my camera is doing. I often will turn off the auto ISO when I'm using flash, and I'll manually set my auto ISO. The reason why it creates some problems is that flash won't work with shutter speeds that are faster than 1/200th or 1/250th of a second. So there is a sync speed, a maximum sync speed for most flashes. So when you're using flash, the camera, when you've got any sort of priority or auto settings, is trying to make sure you're not using a shutter speed that's faster than those shutter speeds so that the flash can sync with the shutter. Most flashes allow you to enable a high speed sync option for your flash, so you can use faster shutter speeds, but that will limit the range of your flash. So because of all of these variables that are at play, if you're introducing auto ISO into the mix, you can sometimes get some weird results. It doesn't necessarily mean that you end up with overexposure because of the flash, but you can get some exposure problems. So if I notice that my camera is having trouble working with the flash and auto ISO, I will turn off the auto ISO and switch over to manual ISO and manually adjust my ISO until I get the proper exposure. But you might have to do that with your shutter speed and your aperture as well. You might have to switch over to full manual mode when you're working with flash to get the best results, because sometimes the system just can't handle all the variables and you get the wrong exposure as a result.
All right, and speaking of exposure and thinking back to some of the backlighting shots that you did, how do you approach exposure in your backlit shots? This is a question from SISTAR.
Fantastic question. And my approach to exposure really depends on what it is that I'm trying to achieve artistically. So one thing that I always consider is I try to avoid overexposure, clipping of the highlights in the image, because you can't recover detail when with a digital file. If something is rendered as pure white, then you can never recover the detail later when you're processing the image. So usually I'm trying to avoid overexposing any of my highlights. Those clipped highlights look much, much worse than underexposed shadow areas. So even if you don't have details in the shadow, if they're pure black, that might be okay, especially if you're looking for a silhouette look. But those overexposed highlights are typically problematic. So I'm usually trying to avoid them. Sometimes in really high contrast situations, it's okay if you're working with a rimlet subject to have some overexposure of the hair or the feathers that are backlit by the sun. Sometimes you have to make some compromises to correct your overall exposure, but usually I'm trying to avoid having those overexposed highlights. So that's my primary concern. But then my secondary concern is, what do I want artistically the image to look like? So if I want a really dramatic silhouette effect, I will sometimes underexpose the file when I'm shooting in camera. You can also do the exposure changes later in the raw processing. So one thing you might want to consider is optimizing the digital file by keeping your exposure as high as you can without overexposing your highlights. And then later when you're processing the file, you can darken the overall exposure to get it where you want. That means you're going to have a much cleaner digital file because digital noise builds up in the shadows and in underexposed areas. So I usually am cautious about intentionally underexposing in camera unless I know that I'm not going to later try to pull detail out of those shadows. So I might strongly underexpose, like for that photo of the lioness that was rimlet. That was very strongly underexposed, -2 or -3 exposure compensation in camera. Because I knew I wanted to have that strong silhouette effect. For other backlight situations, I'm not looking to get that silhouette effect. I'm looking to retain some detail in the animal. So if you think of the lion cub photo that I showed, where there was plenty of detail in the animal, there I chose to avoid underexposing dramatically and instead went for a more conventional neutral exposure because I wanted to keep that detail. So it just really depends on what look that I want for my file.
All right. Our next question is from Lynn. You have some really great timing and composition on your photography. So she's wondering how you're taking, are you clicking rapidly or are you waiting for the perfect moment to strike?
So there is a technique that a lot of photographers use. It's called spray and pray, which basically means just taking lots and lots of photos over and over again and hoping that one of them will come out. I do my fair share of spray and pray. I think that there is a time and a place for it, especially when you're moving with fast moving subjects, a lot of action. But for me, I actually tend, when I'm shooting wildlife, not to be pressing the motor drive real hard and shooting shot after shot after shot. I'm more looking for that moment when the composition comes together. So all the visual elements in the scene align in a way that's pleasing compositionally. And I'm also working a lot in unusual lighting situations. So I tend to be more of a one and done type of guy when it comes to taking pictures. So I'm waiting for that perfect moment. I trigger shutter when I see the moment come together, and it's not really heavy on the motor drive for most of my shooting. So it's a different approach. You know, if I'm fighting a pair of male lions, you know, if I'm photographing a pair of male lions that are fighting, I'll probably hit my motor drive pretty hard in a situation like that. But with a lot of the shots that I'm taking, I'm really just waiting for that perfect compositional moment to come together, and I'm taking the shot when it happens.
All right. Our next question is from the letter G, no name, just G. Is hyperfocal distance an important factor in your shooting? Well,
G, actually, I think that's very, very cool of you that you've reduced your name to one letter. I might do the same.
So the photographer formerly known as
yes, I'm the photographer formerly known as Ian, but now I'm I.
Okay.
So I'm going to go with I. So great question, G. Hyperfocal distance is something that's more important with landscape work. Typically not that important with wildlife work. So the hyperfocal distance is a hypothetical point that you focus on between your foreground subject and your background subject that optimizes your depth of field. So when you focus on a point, the zone of apparent focus spreads from that point. And when you use smaller apertures, you spread that zone of apparent focus further away from that one focus point. And so the hyperfocal point is that point that optimizes that spreading zone of focus so that the flowers in your foreground and the mountain in your background are all sharply in focus in the final photograph. And with landscape, this is very important because the convention with landscape photography is to try to get everything in the scene sharply in focus, to have that appearance of sharp focus. With wildlife, it's typically the opposite. Usually wildlife photographers are going for a selective focus effect. So we're using wide open apertures to narrow the depth of field, to narrow that zone of focus so that only our wildlife subject is in focus and anything behind or in front of the wildlife subject is increasingly out of focus the farther away it is from your subject. So hyperfocal distance is not something that you typically think of when you're photographing wildlife. It is something I do think about when I'm working with a wide angle lens and I'm trying to include the landscape around the wildlife subject. So it's not something I've done that much in Kenya because there's not really interesting landscape. I might want to incorporate a lot of clouds in the sky in the background. But if the clouds aren't sharply in focus at all, that's usually not a problem. But when I'm, for example, photographing orangutans in the jungles of Sumatra in Indonesia, working with a wide angle lens as the orangutans come close, I might use hyperfocal distance focusing so that I can get both my subject, the orangutan, and the beautiful rainforest in the background sharply in focus. So typically hyperfocal distance is not something you want to think about with wildlife. But if you do a lot of other types of photography and you want to learn more about hyperfocal distance and depth of field and all that stuff, I strongly recommend my ebook video course, Focusing for Landscape Photography. It will tell you everything you need to know about making sure you always get perfectly sharp images.
All right. Our next question is from Charlie. Bit of a broad question, but we'll throw it at you anyway. How about high key images? Any advice?
Charlie, great question. And so with high key photographs, first of all, this is something I have to admit, this is not something I often do. It's something I would like to do more of. So a high key image is an image that uses intentional overexposure. So I like using underexposure a lot to create dramatic lighting effect with backlit subjects. But a high key photograph is a photograph where you're intentionally overexposing most of the image. And I think this works best if you've got different light on your background and your subject. So let's say you have an animal subject in the foreground and it's in the shadow and the background is in the light. You can you can set your exposure for your wildlife subject that's in shadow. And by setting a proper exposure for that subject, you end up rendering the rest of the scene as overexposed as pure white. So this is a much different look, and it's usually not very common with wildlife photography, but I think you can get creative with it. The challenge, the photo challenge that's going on right now with Outdoor Photography Guide during week 2 of exposure, there was some really interesting high-key wildlife photos that were included. in the submissions that are part of my weekend roundup that's currently on the Facebook page for that challenge. So you should go check some of those out. Those are some pretty good examples of effectively using high key photography. But it's something I don't do that often, and it's a little bit more difficult to do, I think, effectively than it is with dramatic underexposure of photos.
All right, Tracy asks, how do you get focus on all animals in a photo? If you have multiple animals that are moving, how can you get all of them to look perfect?
Well, that is probably very difficult, especially if you're working with longer telephoto lenses that have less apparent depth of field than wide-angle lenses. So there's really no way that you can get, if you're shooting, let's say, with a 400 millimeter lens, even if you stop down and use a really small aperture to increase your depth of field, you're probably going to have a difficult time getting multiple animals in focus if they are in different focal planes. So if you've got, let's say, 3 zebras that are lined up and they are all the same distance away from you, then it's easy to get them all in focus. But if you've got one zebra 20 feet away, another zebra 40 feet away, and another 60 feet away, it's really, really difficult to get them all in focus because they occupy different planes of focus and they're far apart. And so even if you use a small aperture to extend your depth of field with a long telephoto lens, you're probably not going to have enough depth of field to cover all those animals. You could try focus stacking, taking separate photos of each animal and then blending them together to have them all in focus, but that might be pretty difficult to do if the animals are moving around. And it might be very obvious if you just take the 3 different shots and blend them together, because each animal will have out of focus areas behind and in front. So you'll have this weird shot with sharp focus, no focus, sharp focus, no focus, sharp focus, no focus. And it might look uncanny to the viewer. So the best thing I think you can do if you're photographing wildlife with telephoto lenses and you want them all in focus is try to select a position where your distance relative to your subjects is the same, so that all of the animals are on the same focal plane so that they'll all be in focus. The better strategy is to learn how to work creatively with selective focus. So you're looking for compositions where you're focusing on one of the animal subjects and throwing the others creatively out of focus by using that limited depth of field, but doing so in a way that creates an overall pleasing composition.
All right. Thinking back to some of those big cat photos that you have, especially at nighttime, George is wondering, how do you eliminate or reduce getting the eye shine at nighttime with your flash?
Yeah, okay, that's a really fantastic question. A lot of animal subjects, you'll get what's known as red eye, like humans have red eye. With cats, it's green eye. It's that reflection of the light inside the retina. I'm not exactly sure technically how it works, but it can be rather unrealistic and unpleasant looking, and it can make your cats look like they're, if you're shooting a big cat, it'll make it look like an alien cat or something like that. So to avoid getting that red eye look, you can do a few things. One, if you're shooting with low power, if the flash is low power, which I often do, that helps mitigate that red eye or green eye effect. Another thing you can do is get the flash off of the camera using a flash bracket, or if you've got a remote system for your flash, a slave unit for the flash, you can have an assistant hold the flash for you and aim it, or a photo buddy that you might be traveling with, or even just finding a way to secure your flash off camera. But a flash bracket is a really useful thing because it gets the flash just a little bit away from the center of the lens, and that will change the angle of the light and help eliminate that red eye or green eye effect.
All right, I think we have time for one more question. It's a pretty bulky one, still in the vein of nighttime photography. This one's from Bruce. So much wildlife photography seems to be in low light situations. It seems to get the shutter speed you need to capture a sharp image. You need to increase the ISO, which then introduces noise to the image. What's your advice on handling these shots and avoiding digital noise? Okay,
this is a fantastic question. You are absolutely right. When you're shooting, when I'm shooting in low light conditions, I'm often working with really high ISOs to get the shutter speed that I need. And if you use supplemental light, you can help mitigate that. You can keep your exposure lower and keep your ISO lower. But I'm often, some of the shots I'm looking at, I get back and I realize I've shot at ISO 20,000 or 10,000, which is ridiculous. Some cameras, a lot of the modern digital cameras, the high-end cameras, handle high ISO noise remarkably well. Like the amount of improvement that we've seen in the past 5 years alone has been astounding. But not all camera systems handle this high ISO as well as others. There's a few things that you can do to help mitigate this. I mentioned using artificial light. Another thing you can do is to make sure that your exposure is proper. If you're underexposing the critical parts of your photo with high ISOs, and then as you try to increase the exposure of those parts of the photo when you're processing the file, you'll see digital noise come out really, really strong. But if you've got a properly exposed file, if you're pushing that exposure, as it's often said, pushing the exposure to the right of the histogram as far as possible, which means giving the photo as much exposure as you can without overexposing or clipping your highlights, with a properly exposed digital file, you'll see that the high ISO noise isn't nearly as bad as it would otherwise be. So some of the photos that I've taken at ISO 10,000 or 20,000, because they were properly exposed, I'm shocked at how little noise there actually is in those files. Now, in areas with a lot of detail, you probably notice the noise less. With the photos that I've taken in Africa, when I'm working with the animals at twilight with the big skies, a lot of times, because there's less detail in the sky, I'll notice digital noise there, more so than I do in the more detailed parts of the image, like around the animal. But for those areas of the sky that have a lot of noise, because there's not a lot of detail that I need to preserve, it's easy to apply noise reduction specifically to those areas, target it to those areas, and get rid of the noise because I don't have to worry about the detail. So a little bit of noise reduction in post-processing can help a lot as well. One thing you want to avoid doing, I've often, when I've been leading a workshop or a tour, when we're photographing wildlife, some people don't like the idea of shooting with auto ISO because they're worried. They're like, well, what happens if my ISO goes up to 20,000 and it's a useless file? I tell people, you know what? If you shoot at ISO 20,000, you might end up with a file that you can't use. But if you stop shooting because you're at ISO 20,000, then you definitely will not end up with a photo at all. So take a chance, even when you're working with those high ISOs, knowing that you might end up having to throw the file out or it might be useless. Take a chance, shoot it anyways. When I notice my ISO is creeping up, what I typically try to do is drop my shutter speed to a point that will reduce the ISO. So I'll seek to get it down to a point where I might just be shooting on the very edge of getting my subject sharp. And so I know that because the lower shutter speed might make it more difficult for me to get that sharp photo, I just take a lot of photos at that time, hoping that one of them will come out sharp. So you can start making compromises when you see your ISO creeping up too much. When the light is really low like that, at the end of the day, you're going to end up making all sorts of compromises. So my advice is make whatever compromises are necessary, just keep shooting. And if you're lucky, some of them will come out. If you're not lucky, oh well, nothing lost, nothing ventured, nothing gained.
All right. Do you have any closing remarks for us, Ian?
Yeah, I did notice there was one other question I noticed that seems to pop up whenever I'm showing photographs from the Maasai Mara area about photographing after dark. There are several different areas in the Maasai Mara. There's the natural, it's a national reserve, and there's also the conservancy, which is a patchwork of privately owned land. So there's different regulations for each of those areas. In the national reserve, you're not allowed to be out after dark at night. There's more flexibility in the morning to go out for early morning shooting. But if you're shooting in the conservancy, because it's private land, there's a lot more flexibility. It's a bit more expensive shooting there. So as a general rule, when you're on safari in Africa, you want to find out if there are any rules or regulations. So for example, when you're shooting in Serengeti National Park in Tanzania, the rules are very strictly applied there regarding the times that you can be out. They don't want people out at night at all. So being out to shoot for sunrise or sunset is a very difficult thing. In the Maasai Mara, things are a bit more relaxed. And if you're shooting in a private area like the Conservancy or other private reserves throughout Africa, you can basically do whatever you want because it is private land. So when you're planning a safari adventure, when you're thinking about the types of shots that you want to take, you want to look at the local rules and regulations and how they're enforced before you make a decision about where you go, because it may affect what types of shots you're able to get. So I'm always studying that to make sure that I'm going to be able to do the types of photography I want to do without getting arrested for doing the wrong thing. So that, I think, is the last question I'll ask for today. Thank you so very much for attending this exciting episode of OPG Live. I will not be back in November because I'm going to be in Ethiopia the entire month, but I will be returning for OPG Live in December, hopefully with some fantastic photos from that trip. I've got my fingers crossed. I'm really excited about it. I'm going to be photographing beautiful mountain scenery, really remarkable wildlife, an active volcano. It's going to be really exciting, and I can't wait to come back and share my adventure with you guys. Thank you so much for coming, and I'll see you again in December. Goodbye.
Bye.